Welcome to Military Analytics. In the Russia-Ukraine war, sending ammunition and soldiers to the conflict zones via bridges and railways is an inevitable need for both armies because the loss of supply lines brings failure in the war. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army has successfully destroyed many railroads and bridges used by the Russian invaders as supply lines unable to deliver troops and ammunition to the conflict zones. The Russian army was forced to retreat from many regions. The inability of the Russian army to make shipments to the conflict areas was frequently brought to the fore by the statements made by the Russian soldiers during the winter months. The statements of the soldiers revealed the magnitude of the troubles they were experiencing. Russian soldiers were freezing to death at the front because they could not even get their winter clothes. In addition, the lack of ammunition resulted in the Russian invaders not responding to the attacks of the Ukrainian army. The first important supply line lost by the Russian invaders was the Kerch Bridge. The construction of this bridge began in 2015 on the orders of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. This date was very significant. The Russian army invaded Crimea in 2014, immediately after the invasion. Construction of the Kerch Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea began. This was Putin's preparation for the invasion of Ukraine, which he launched in February 2022. Putin was going to send troops and weapons from Russia to Crimea and from there expanding to Ukrainian territory. But in an unexpected attack, the Kerch Bridge was destroyed shortly after the start of the invasion of Ukraine. There have been many interpretations of the destruction of the Kerch Bridge. Russia claimed that the bridge was blown up by a car bomb. Another claim was that the explosion was the result of a drone attack. Another claim was that the explosion was caused by a boat passing under the bridge during the explosion. Many other allegations came to the fore, but it is not clear how the bridge was blown up. The only known fact was that the Russian army lost a very important bridge. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Bakhmut has undoubtedly seen the most fighting. The Russian army also lost its supply bridges in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army has inflicted great losses on the invaders with its attacks in recent months. These losses included supply lines. The UK Ministry of Defense made the following statement about the bridges lost by the Russian invaders in Bakhmut in the city center. The Bakhmut River now defines the front line. Ukrainian forces hold the west of the city and have destroyed key bridges over the river, which runs from north to the south along a 200-800 meters wide strip of an open space, with Ukrainian troops firing from fortified buildings to the west. This area has become a killing zone and is likely to make it extremely difficult for Wagner's forces to try to continue their frontal assaults to the west. One of the bridges that the Ukrainian army occupied in Bakhmut was a bridge connecting Bakhmut and the city of Konstantinivka. The plan of the Russian army was to occupy Bakhmut, cross over the bridge to Konstantinivka and expanding into Ukrainian territory. But as a result of the Ukrainian army's offensive, the bridge collapsed along with the Russian army's plan. Kakhovka Bridge is another important bridge through which the Russian invaders transported troops and ammunition. This bridge over the Kakhovka Dam is located in the Kherson region. This bridge, which was frequently used by the Russian invaders, was destroyed as a result of an attack by the Ukrainian army. A Ukrainian official made the following statement after the operation targeting the Kakhovka Bridge. They will try to repair the destroyed bridge, look for an alternative crossing. But they are running out of time and money. As soon as they built a new bridge, we will destroy it again. Knowing the value of supply lines in warfare, the Ukrainian army has targeted bridges, one of the most important supply lines of the Russian invaders since the beginning of the war. One of these bridges was the bridge of the Molokna River. The Russian invaders used this bridge as the main supply line to cover the deficiencies at the front. Also, an important feature of this bridge was to connect the city of Melitopol with a village in Zaporizhia. Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of Melitopol, made a statement about the bridge, which was blown up when the Russian army attacked it with HIMARS missiles. Fedorov sarcastically said that the bridge was tired, adding the Ukrainian armed forces are always nearby. You will run away without looking back. The Ukrainian army destroyed railroads as well as bridges used by the Russian occupiers as supply lines. One of the destroyed supply lines was the railroad in Sanko, Crimea. Moreover, the timing of the destruction of this bridge was very significant. The timing of the Ukrainian army caused more casualties to the Russian occupiers because the railroad was blown up while the Russian invaders were transporting Kalibr cruise missiles over this railway. The Russian army, which already has an increasing ammunition problem every day, lost many important ammunition, especially Kalibr missiles, as a result of this attack. The loss of the supply lines used by the Russian occupiers for the transportation of troops and ammunition means that their problems on the front line are increasing in the face of the spring operation in which the Ukrainian army is preparing for a counterattack. And Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said the attack may start at any moment. It seems that the Russian invaders will have a big problem because they have lost their supply lines. The Ukrainian army has been preparing for a counterattack for a long time. It seems that the course of the war will change after this attack, which aims to completely remove the Russian invaders from Ukrainian territory in the face of the increasing losses of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army continues to strengthen with the support of Western and European countries. Western and European countries provided military aid to the Ukrainian army for the counterattack called the Spring Attack. These acts will cause the attack to be even stronger. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has tried many ways to compensate for the losses he suffered at the front, but without success. The Russian people do not support Putin's inhuman practices. For this reason, Russian youth do not want to take part in the occupation of Ukraine. The Russian army, which has lost approximately 200,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war, is also having trouble finding soldiers, in addition to the problem of military personnel and ammunition. The destruction of supply lines seems to bring Russia to its end. Unlike Russia, the Ukrainian army continues to grow stronger every day. Ukrainian leader Zelensky is making history against the Russian invaders with his people and army who believe in victory, while Putin is struggling with a series of problems that he never thought of when he started the occupation of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has repelled Russian invaders from many occupied territories. Many of the soldiers in the occupied territories are waiting for the right moment to surrender to Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian army is using a number of practices to integrate Russian soldiers who want to surrender into the army or free them. Thanks to the I Want to Live project, tens of thousands of Russians surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers who surrendered continued to explain the problems they experienced in the Russian army. These statements not only show the ruthlessness of the occupiers, but also prove that they are exhausted. With the decision to invade Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin threw Russia into one of the deepest and darkest pits in world history. The dissolution of the Russian army on the Ukrainian fronts and the dragging of the war into Russia from time to time caused great fear, anxiety, and panic among the Russian people. As the Russian army melted, Putin tried to patch up his army's wounds with interim mobilization decisions. But this angered the Russian people even more. And as the Russian people grappled with economic sanctions and severe poverty escapes from Russia, protests and anti-war movements increased the economic budget deficits, which were ignored by many people and institutions in Russia. The financial crisis brought on by the war and the budget allocated to the Russian army actually caused a completely different war to start in the country. This war is described as the economic clash that Vladimir Putin opened to the Russian people. Russian oil and Russian assets lost value on the world market. Billions of dollars in Russian assets were confiscated. Exports of the Russian defense industry suffered greatly as a natural consequence of all this. Millions of citizens are currently unemployed in Russia, and almost none of the Western companies are working with Russia. According to current calculations, the sanctions imposed on Russia by the West and the USA have dragged Russia into a complete collapse. Here there were especially frozen assets that tied the hands of the Russian economy. Belgium alone froze more than $250 billion in Russian assets. The temporary and permanent cost of all sanctions to Russia exceeds $1 trillion. A significant amount of these are frozen assets. Revenues from frozen Russian assets resulting from the sanctions imposed on Russia have reached levels sufficient to rebuild Ukraine. Yes, you heard right. As a result of the blocking and freezing of Russian assets, a new Ukraine can be built. Of course, the USA, one of the guarantor countries of Ukraine's territorial integrity, is one of the countries that are making the most serious efforts to freeze Russian assets so that Ukraine can be rebuilt. The U.S. administration blocked more than $58 billion in value owned or controlled by sanctioned Russians last year. This figure is literally a record. Russia is at the forefront of the countries that have been subject to the most sanctions due to the war so far. The fact that such a large amount of income was obtained from the sanctions implemented under the leadership of the USA to discourage Russia from this war brought the issue of rebuilding Ukraine to the agenda. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made very striking statements on this subject. Janet Yellen argued that Russia should pay for the damage it caused to Ukraine and that these sanctions against Russia should continue much more harshly. Yellen was quite right about that. As a result of the heavy sanctions imposed by the USA, Russia was deprived of the equipment it needed to wage the war, and the Moscow administration could not reach the budget it was targeting in any way. In addition, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen added that they implemented the sanctions against Russia with the coalition partners they work with on this issue. When we look at the historical regressions in the Russian army after these striking sanction decisions, we see once again how vital the restrictions imposed on Russia by the USA and other Western states and international organizations are, because the sanctions imposed by the USA and other countries reduced Putin's revenues by about 40% last year. In addition, since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the United States and its allies have imposed sanctions on more than 9,600 people, causing internal clashes in Russia. This impressive effort targeted oligarchs and their family members, as well as a number of Russian government and military officials and non-state regime proxies. On this subject, Putin expressed little sympathy for oligarchs who lost their offshore properties and bank accounts in his annual address this February. The Russian leader has determined that their choice is to live as second-class citizens in their Western palaces or to invest their wealth in their own country for the benefit of the Russian people. Putin reinforced this message at a meeting with Russian business circles in March. Putin's comments, of course, contradicted his own role as chief kleptocrat. Russian oligarchs and other elites occupy a privileged position as the regime's main support base. But Kremlin ties do not guarantee influence over policy decisions. On the contrary, those who benefit from Putin's patronage system seem unlikely to protest when faced with outside pressure. Given the debtor's debt to the state and the risk of retaliation if any oligarch is pressuring Putin to end the war, there is no sign that Putin is listening. But the freezing of Russian assets reflects a compelling logic. Sanctioned Russian individuals, unable to access their offshore wealth, can lobby the government for policy changes. Autocrats tend to resist such pressures, regardless of the number of their adherents, family members, and adherents. But faced with the fraying support of the voters who hold them in power, the leaders will bow to foreign demands. In other words, sooner or later, Putin will be in a position to stand against this economic crisis. In addition to the U.S. sanctions to put Putin under pressure, the European Union is also making a serious effort in this regard. The EU imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions against Russia in response to the war of aggression against Ukraine that began on February 24, 2022, and the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. The EU sanctions include individual sanctions, economic sanctions, and visa measures. The purpose of the EU's economic sanctions is to impose serious consequences on Russia for its actions and effectively hinder Russia's ability to continue aggression. The EU's individual sanctions, on the other hand, target those who are responsible for or benefit from supporting, financing, or implementing actions that undermine Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. In total, the EU imposed sanctions on 1,473 individuals and 207 entities. Taking into account the previous individual sanctions imposed after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, this list of sanctions includes Russian President Vladimir Putin, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Russian State Duma members, and many other striking names. However, the figures announced these days seems much more striking than the names in the list because the rate of assets frozen in the EU currently exceeds $21.5 billion. In addition, the ratio of the assets of the Central Bank of Russia blocked in EU and G7 countries reached a record level of $300 billion as a part of economic sanctions. The EU has imposed a series of import and export restrictions on Russia. This means that European organizations cannot sell certain products to Russia, and Russian organizations are not allowed to sell certain products to the EU. The list of banned products is designed to maximize the negative impact of sanctions on the Russian economy and limit the consequences for EU businesses and citizens. Export and import restriction. These include products primarily intended for consumption and products related to health, pharmaceuticals, food, and agriculture so as not to harm the Russian population. According to the European Commission, since February 2022, the EU has banned more than 43.9 billion euros in goods exported to Russia and 91.2 billion euros in imported goods. Moreover, the EU, in cooperation with other like-minded partners, adopted a statement reserving the right to stop treating Russia as the most preferred country within the WTO framework. Moreover, the EU has decided to act on this issue not through an increase in import tariffs, but through a series of restrictive measures that include bans on the import or export of certain goods. The EU and its partners have also suspended any work on Belarus's accession to the WTO. On the other hand, the EU has banned the provision of certain business-related services to the Russian government or any legal entity, such as companies and other organizations or bodies established in Russia in order to hit the Russian economy, which is heavily dependent on imports of services from European companies. Since June 4, 2022, it is prohibited to provide directly or indirectly bookkeeping and tax advisory services, including accounting, auditing, legal audits, as well as business and management advisory or public relations services. To further strengthen the pressure on Russia's industrial capacity, the EU also decided in October 2022 to expand the scope of services that are no longer available to Russia to include consulting, legal advice, architectural and engineering services. Also in December 2022, a ban was added to the provision of EU advertising, market research and opinion poll services as well as product testing and technical inspection services. Finally, the European Council adopted a sixth package of sanctions that prohibits, inter alia, the purchase, importation or transfer of offshore crude oil and certain petroleum products from Russia to the EU. In short, international powers like both the USA and the EU continue to do their best to help Russia withdraw from Ukraine and build a new Ukraine. We hope that as soon as possible, these sanctions against Russia will yield results and a new and free Ukraine can resume its peaceful and quiet days in Eastern Europe. The battle for the city of Bakhmut has become the most crucial part of the Ukraine war. Both Ukraine and Russia have focused their efforts on this small city in recent months. Despite all its impossibilities, Russia is attacking with all its might to make a tangible gain in the war that has been going on for more than a year. But it can't get past the steel curtain of Ukraine's defense. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, perfectly demonstrates its defensive capabilities while at the same time inflicting heavy damage on the Russian army with offensive operations. The other day, the large ammunition depot of the Russian army near Bakhmut was destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The huge arsenal of the Russians was used jointly by the Chechen troops of Wagner and Kalibr. Considering the current shortage of ammunition, as well as the serious logistical problems in this aspect of the front line, the loss of large numbers of shells will put the Russian army in serious trouble in the later days of the war. According to preliminary data, it was reported that a few days ago in the explosion of an ammunition depot in the south of Bakhmut, Russian soldiers were also killed in addition to the ammunition of the Russian army. But there was still no official information about how many soldiers died. It was probably the troops of Wagner and Kalibr that were destroyed here. It is known that this direction is actively used by the armed forces of Ukraine, which is trying to unblock their territory, to withdraw some of the units from the city. But the Wagner PMC fighters are also located here in defensive positions. To this day, battles for Bakhmut continue actively. At the same time, it is known that Russian troops control about 30% of the territory of the city. And at the moment the armed forces of Ukraine are advancing from the eastern direction. Also, efforts by the Wagner PMC to fight on the front lines and try to break through the Ukrainian defense lines are also fruitless. After 14 Leopard tanks from Poland were sent to the region, Russian troops and Wagner PMC began to lose their effectiveness in the region. Wagner is constantly making publications and statements that he is advancing in Bakhmut and pushing back the Ukrainian army. But contrary to what is believed, the opposite is true. The Ukrainian army does not hesitate to use its advanced weapons against the Wagner troops, who, together with the Russian troops, suffered huge losses in Bakhmut. Ukraine's Western partners rolled up their sleeves in order to increase Ukraine's war effort and not lose its frontline superiority. Tanks committed by the USA and UK gradually began to enter the Ukrainian army inventory. On the other hand, there is participation from many Western countries in the tank coalition led by Poland, and the number of tanks to be given to Ukraine from the coalition officials is astonishing. All of these efforts, of course, are taking place in order for Ukraine to win the war and to prevent the harmful policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Particularly NATO member Eastern European countries know that if Russia wins the Ukraine war, it will be their turn, and they support Ukraine in its just struggle with all their might. We can easily see on the front line that Ukraine is not left these supports unanswered. After the Ukrainian army received the bombs of the JDAM family from the USA, these weapons began to be used to attack the territory of Bakhmut and its surroundings. These aerial bombs are used, among other things, to attack Wagner troops and Russian army elements stationed in Bakhmut. Since such aerial bombs can be launched from distances of up to 72 kilometers and the damage they inflict is huge, we can say that it is the end game for Wagner PMC. The Ukrainian army has not yet made a statement about the use of such weapons, but the US has previously confirmed that these weapons are being used by the Ukrainian army. The ammunition is most likely used by MiG-29 and Su-27 aircraft in service with the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, the fact that the Ukrainian army has reached the stage of ending the Wagner presence in Bakhmut shows us that victory is near for Bakhmut. So do the initiatives of the Ukrainian army prevent the attacks of the Russian army? The answer to that is, unfortunately, no. Despite significant losses, the Russian army continues offensive operations in Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka and Shakhtarsk directions. In the past day, units of the Ukraine Defense Forces repelled more than 100 Russian attacks in the indicated directions. During the day, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 10 attacks on the areas where the Russian troops were concentrated. Ukrainian missile and artillery units struck 5 areas where Russian troops were deployed, Russian personnel and military equipment, as well as 3 ammunition depots and 4 electronic warfare systems were destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian General Staff emphasizes that the Russian Federation is using terrorist tactics, bombing settlements indiscriminately, and this is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. In the past day, the Russian army carried out 5 missile attacks, mainly on civilian infrastructure objects in the Sumy and Donetsk regions. There were reported deaths and injuries among civilians. The Russian army also carried out 35 airstrikes and 76 attacks using multiple launch rocket systems. But the majority of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainian defense troops. Still, the threat of new missile strikes on Ukrainian soil remains high and the Ukrainian defense forces are focused on future attacks. With the losses of the Russian army in recent days, the loss of soldiers of the Russian army since February 2022, when the war started, is around 160,000, according to the Ukrainian military. Russia allegedly launched more than 100 unsuccessful attacks on Ukraine in one day. The alleged attacks are the latest indication that he is trying to advance the special military operation launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin's forces continued to stagnate in Ukraine after more than a year of conflict, with conflicts largely concentrated in Ukraine's easternmost regions, including the Donbass. Russia continued to lay claim to areas where it failed to succeed, including the eastern city of Bakhmut, where some of the conflict's most intense fighting took place. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported earlier in the week that its forces had repulsed several attacks from 5 key cities, including Bakhmut. Amid speculation earlier in the week that Russia could approach the city, the Russian military is not giving up its efforts to continue the war in Ukraine. Despite the significant losses, the Russian army continues its offensive activities in the directions of Limansky, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariinsky and the last day units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces repelled 102 Russian attacks on these lines. The Russian army also carried out other attacks, including 3 missile attacks on the city of Sloviansk. Amid the setbacks, Russia turned to attacks on Ukraine's civil and energy infrastructure during the winter months to put more pressure on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to get to the negotiating table. Russia also conducted 8 airstrikes and carried out 49 bombardments from bottom-firing jet systems. The Ukrainian military has accused Russia of using terrorist tactics against Ukraine, the latest in allegations that Russia violated human rights throughout the war. It was alleged that the Russian Federation grossly violated international humanitarian law standards and continued to use terrorist tactics by indiscriminately bombing Ukrainian settlements. Ukraine claimed that it repelled these attacks, as Moscow seeks a rare victory after months of stagnation. Both Russia and Ukraine continue to fight for control of Bakhmut, which experts say bears more symbolic significance for Russia. Ukraine has two current targets for Bakhmut: to reduce as much as possible the combat-ready personnel of the Russian army, and to squeeze them into several grueling key battles, interrupting their offensive and concentrating elsewhere the resources of the Ukrainian army for the spring counteroffensive. You, our esteemed followers, know now, like the whole world, that by another place here you mean Crimea. The Ukrainian army and the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, say at every opportunity that Crimea should be liberated from Russian control and emphasized that steps have been taken in this regard.